What if the one woman London laughed at was the only person a wild beast would trust? At the height of the social season, when beauty was treated like currency and cruelty passed for wit, Lady Beatrice Whitcombe had already been judged, mocked, and dismissed by everyone who mattered. To London, she was a scandal in silk. To the Duke of Ravenshaw, she was a joke he did not hesitate to make. But everything changed the moment his savage black stallion, an animal feared by riders across England, refused every command, every hand, and every show of force, except hers. In a world built on pride, appearances, and power, one unexpected bond would turn humiliation into wonder and silence an entire society. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. The morning at Whitcombe Estate began the way most mornings did, quiet, clipped, orderly. The sort of calm that belonged to old money and well-trained servants. The lawns lay smooth beneath a thin veil of mist, the hedges stood trimmed to perfection, and the manor's windows caught the pale light like polished glass. Then the south stables erupted. Metal shrieked against metal, an ugly scraping scream followed by a thunderous crash that rattled the corridor windows. A few birds exploded from the trees in a panicked black scatter. Somewhere inside the manor, a maid dropped a tray with a sharp, brittle clatter. Stables, a footman shouted. South stables, boots pounded on gravel. Grooms and stable hands sprinted as if the devil himself had opened the doors. They reached the long timber building and were met by chaos spilling into the yard like smoke. A massive black stallion reared inside the central aisle, its hooves striking the wooden boards with the force of a hammer. It was too large to be called merely a horse. It looked carved from storm cloud and muscle mane whipping as it threw its head eyes, white-rimmed and wild. The iron rings along its stall door trembled with every impact, and the scent of sweat and fear hung thick in the air. "Hold him," someone barked. A young trainer, too eager, too proud, had a rope looped around the stallion's neck and tried to pull the animal's head down. The stallion's response was swift, brutal, and unmistakably intelligent. It lunged, twisted, and struck out. The stall door splintered. The man went flying backward, crashing into a mound of straw. His cry turned into a wheeze as the breath left his lungs. Another groom stumbled away, hands lifted, like a man confronted by a loaded pistol. "Back!" a stable hand screamed. "Back! Don't you see? He'll kill someone." No one moved in closer. Not even the bravest of them, not after what they had heard about this stallion, not after what they had already seen this morning. And standing in the aisle, as if the chaos belonged to him, was Duke Alistair Ravenshaw. He was tall in that effortless way men of power often were, broad-shouldered in a dark riding coat that fitted him like a uniform. His hair was swept back, his jaw set hard as carved stone. He held the end of the lead rope in one gloved hand, but he did not pull. He kept just enough distance to avoid a death kick, just close enough to make it clear he refused to be driven away. The stallion pivoted toward him, ears pinned, flat breath blasting from its nostrils in visible bursts. It struck the floor again, a warning that rattled through every rib in the building. A footman, trembling, leaned toward the Duke. "Your Grace, we should shut him in," before Number Ravenshaw's voice cut like a blade. Not loud, not frantic, simply absolute. He stared at the animal the way a man might stare at a rival who had humiliated him in public. "This horse is worth more than this estate," he said, tone controlled and edged with fury. "I will not have him reduced to a mad beast. A stable hand, mister." Dalton, the senior trainer at Whitcombe, hovered near the entrance, pale but trying to appear composed. Your Grace, with respect, he isn't being reduced. This is what he is. Ravenshaw's gaze snapped to Dalton. Then, you're telling me no one can handle him. Dalton hesitated just long enough for the Duke's pride to sharpen. Before anyone could answer, the stable doors opened again. Lady Beatrice Whitcombe stepped inside. She was not dressed for a ballroom, not wrapped in silks or pearls. She wore a simple riding dress with sleeves pushed up to her forearms, practical boots, hair pinned back neatly. She moved without urgency, but there was nothing weak in her pace. The moment she appeared, conversation faltered. A few heads turned, a few mouths tightened. Someone whispered, barely audible, "My lady." "Please don't." Beatrice didn't look at the servant who spoke. Her eyes were on the stallion. Ravenshaw turned toward her. His gaze traveled quick and assessing over the shape of her body, full-figured, undeniably so, and his mouth curved with a faint, careless mockery as if the world had just offered him a private joke. He spoke loudly enough for the entire stable to hear. "This stallion has thrown the finest riders in England." He looked her up and down, then tilted his head. "Do you truly believe he will listen to you?" A few nervous snickers rose, the kind of laughter people offered to power as protection. Beatrice did not answer him. She stepped into the aisle as if he had said nothing at all, as if the Duke of Ravenshaw were merely another man filling the air with noise. The stallion snapped his head toward her hooves, striking the boards again. A groom flinched. My Lady Dalton hissed, "Don't go closer." Beatrice kept walking. Slowly. Her shoulders loose, her hands visible, her breath steady. She did not stare the stallion down like an enemy. She did not rush him like a conqueror. She spoke softly, almost as though she were speaking to herself. Easy. The stable seemed to shrink into silence. Even the horse's furious stamping paused, suspended in a moment of expectation. The stallion stopped, its eyes fixed on Beatrice. Its ears lifted slightly. Beatrice halted 2 steps away. She extended her hand palm open, offering rather than demanding. The stallion's nostrils flared, its breath slowed, and then without warning, without violence, without spectacle, it stepped forward. One slow, deliberate step, then another. It lowered its head, placed its heavy brow against Beatrice's shoulder. A servant gasped, "God!" Even Dalton's face changed. Astonishment softened the lines of fear into disbelief. Ravenshaw didn't speak. He couldn't. His expression locked in a rare, unguarded shock, as though something inside him had just been rewritten without his consent. Beatrice raised her hand and rested it on the stallion's neck. Not gripping, not claiming, simply touching. The stallion exhaled deep and heavy, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Behind her, the Duke's voice finally came low and rough, with something he didn't name. "What did you do?" Beatrice didn't turn. "I didn't do anything. Don't insult me." Ravenshaw's tone sharpened. "I watched you." Beatrice's fingers moved through the stallion's mane. "You watched me stop." She paused. "That's all." Ravenshaw's eyes narrowed. "Stop. You were trying to win," she said calmly. "So were they?" She tipped her chin toward the men still hovering, like frightened birds. "He isn't interested in who wins." The stallion pressed closer, as if to confirm her words. Dalton swallowed. "Your Grace, I think," he glanced at Beatrice, then at the horse. "I think he only allows her." Ravenshaw tightened his grip on the rope. "Try again," he ordered, as if he could force reality back into a shape he recognized. Dalton approached carefully with the lead. The stallion's muscles instantly tensed. Its ears flattened. Its hoof struck the ground, a warning that made Dalton freeze in place. Beatrice's voice was quiet but firm. "Don't step closer." Dalton stopped. He looked to the Duke, helpless. Ravenshaw took one step forward. The stallion's head whipped toward him, eyes bright with threat. Beatrice laid her hand against the horse's neck. "It's all right." The stallion's body eased. Not fully, not willingly, but enough. Ravenshaw stared at that hand, small, bare, steady, like it was the key to a locked door he'd spent his life kicking. He spoke slowly, each word measured. "This horse injured 3 men in a month. Because they forced him?" Beatrice answered. "A racehorse must be controlled." "No." She finally turned her head slightly, not to look at him fully, but enough to make it clear she had heard him and rejected the idea. "A racehorse must trust." Silence pressed between them. Ravenshaw's gaze moved from her to the stallion. "Epsom Derby is in 6 weeks." Dalton blinked. "Your Grace." "This horse can win?" Ravenshaw continued, voice unwavering. Then he looked at Beatrice as if seeing her in a sharper light. "But only if he listens." He took a breath. Pride fought in his chest, visible even in the slight tension of his jaw. And then, like a man swallowing a bitter draught, he said it. "I need your help training him." One of the servants behind them whispered, stunned, "The Duke is asking her." Beatrice didn't answer at once. She let the stallion breathe against her shoulder. She let the air settle. Then she said, "If you want my help, we do it my way." Ravenshaw's mouth twitched. "Your way?" "Yes." He folded his arms. "And what is your way?" Lady Whitcombe. Beatrice faced him fully now. Her eyes were calm, not submissive. She was not smiling. She was not pleading. She looked at him the way she looked at the stallion, measuring, attentive, unimpressed by titles. "No whip," she said. One of the younger trainers scoffed. "Then how do you expect?" Beatrice's gaze cut to him. "If you strike him, he will kill you." The scoff died. "No chains," she continued. "No forcing," she said, voice steady. "No hauling him until he breaks." Dalton shifted uncomfortably, as though the words pricked him personally. And Beatrice added, "Every decision regarding Storm Sovereign goes through me." Ravenshaw gave a short laugh, low and incredulous. "You're giving orders to a duke." "I'm protecting your horse," she replied. "If you want him to win, you'll listen." Ravenshaw glanced at Storm Sovereign. The stallion stood still, head lowered, calm, only because Beatrice remained calm. The Duke's pride waged war behind his eyes. He looked like a man used to rooms bending around him, used to being obeyed without question. He looked like a man who believed that power should solve everything. Then slowly, he said, "Fine." Dalton's mouth fell open. "Your Grace." Ravenshaw turned sharply. "From today, Lady Beatrice Whitcombe will oversee Storm Sovereign's training." He looked at each man in the stable as if daring them to challenge him, "and no one disobeys her." The sentence struck the stable like a new law. Beatrice nodded once, not triumphant, not grateful, simply accepting the arrangement, the way one accepts weather. Storm Sovereign breathed out softly, and something inside Ravenshaw's expression shifted, just barely, as if he'd stepped into a world where he no longer held all the rules. A woman mocked as the fattest in London, yet she's the only one who can control the most dangerous stallion in England. Is it pure luck or a skill no one else ever cared to understand? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of the story. A few weeks earlier, London had decided who Beatrice Whitcombe was. The chandeliered ballroom at Lady Harcourt's had been bright enough to blind. Candlelight flickered across marble floors. Music swelled, violins carrying laughter and whispered scandal through the air. Women in pastel silk spun like painted flowers. Men in dark coats watched calculated performed. Beatrice entered with her father at her side. Earl Whitcombe was a proud man, his hair silver at the temples, his posture rigid with discipline. But Beatrice had learned to read him the way she read horses. She could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze swept the room as if measuring threat. The whispers began almost immediately. "That's the Earl's daughter," a woman murmured behind a feathered fan. Her companion's lips curled. "Oh, I know her." A pause sharp with cruelty. "The fattest woman in London." Beatrice pretended she hadn't heard. She always pretended. It was easier than watching her father's expression harden into helpless anger. Easier than giving the Rusam what it wanted, a spectacle. She moved toward the champagne table, fingers closing around the stem of a glass with practiced steadiness. Her hand trembled anyway. Not enough for most to notice. Enough for her to feel. A young lord spotted her and leaned toward his friend. He spoke louder than necessary, enjoying his own daring. "If she dances the waltz," he said, "the floor will collapse." A ripple of laughter followed him like a reward. Beatrice's gaze dipped to the marble at her feet. She counted her breaths. A gentleman approached. For one flickering moment, hope did what it always did, rose stupid and bright and impossible. He bowed, handsome, polished, the kind of man who might have been kind if kindness had ever been required of him. Beatrice waited. He smiled not at her, not truly. "Forgive me," he said. "I'm looking for someone else." And he walked away. It was a small cruelty, sharper than loud insults, because it carried the weight of certainty. As if her presence wasn't worth acknowledging for even the length of a dance. Beatrice turned, searching for her father. She found him near the window, watching the room with a tightness that made his face look older. "Father," she said softly. He turned. His eyes flicked over her expression, reading her. Beatrice's voice stayed calm because she had learned calm was armor. "May we go home?" Earl Whitcombe looked around at the glittering crowd. So many mouths, so many eyes, so many judgments dressed as elegance. He nodded once. "Yes," he said. "We'll go." They left without farewell, without argument, without spectacle. In the carriage, London's lamps slid past the window like a river of gold. Beatrice watched her own reflection faintly in the glass, distorted by movement. She spoke into the quiet. "I think London has decided who I am." Her father's reply came instantly, fierce with a love that could not protect her from society. "London has no right to decide your worth." Beatrice's mouth tightened. She shook her head. "They don't decide," she said. "They just remind me every day." Earl Whitcombe's hands tightened on his cane. "Beatrice." The next morning she said it plainly before fear could change her mind. "I won't attend the season again." Her father stared as if she'd spoken of death. Beatrice forced herself to meet his eyes. "It's not surrender," she said quietly. "It's survival." He didn't agree. Not fully. But he didn't command her either. He knew that forcing her back into those rooms would be like throwing a wounded animal into a hunt and expecting it to come back whole. So Beatrice left London. And in the quiet countryside of Berkshire, she found something the city had refused her heir that didn't feel hostile. Whitcombe Estate was old stone and wide fields, hedgerows, and distant woods. The stables smelled of hay, leather, earth. The rhythm of the place wasn't gossip and performance. It was breath-hoof weather. She began spending her days there. At first, the stable hands didn't know what to do with it. They were used to ladies glancing in to pat a pony's nose, then vanishing back into the manor. Beatrice stayed. She asked questions. She listened. One afternoon, Mr. Dalton approached Earl Whitcombe with obvious discomfort. "My lord, your daughter is in the stables all day." Earl Whitcombe didn't look up from his papers. "At least no one hurts her there," he said flatly. And it was true. Horses didn't stare. They didn't whisper. They didn't pretend kindness while sharpening cruelty behind their teeth. Beatrice learned what she could. Feed ratios, temperaments. The way a horse's ear angle could tell you whether it was curious or frightened. The way a shift in breathing could mean pain before any limp appeared. The way impatience in a handler could turn anxiety into violence. Then came the young colt that panicked. It was a raw, frantic kind of fear, the sort that made the animal slam itself against stall walls. The grooms couldn't get near without risking broken bones. The colt's eyes rolled white breath, coming in harsh bursts. "Leave him," someone said. "He'll tire out." Beatrice stepped inside. Dalton grabbed her arm. "My lady, don't." Beatrice gently removed his hand. "He's afraid," she said. "So are we," Dalton muttered. Beatrice stood still. She didn't advance. She simply waited. Let the colt see her without pressure. After a few seconds, she spoke. "It's all right. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a spell. It was something quieter, a willingness to let the colt choose." The colt's breathing slowed. Its hooves stopped striking the wall. It shivered, then lowered its head a fraction, as if the fight drained away. Dalton stared at her. "My lady." "What did you do?" Beatrice gave a small, helpless shrug. "I don't know." But from that day the request began. A mare that refused to eat, a gelding that snapped at hands, a horse that trembled when touched. And again, Beatrice found the same truth: the more people tried to dominate, the worse it became. The more calmly she existed in the space, the more the animals softened. Not because she was strong, because she was patient, because she didn't demand obedience as proof of worth. Duke Alistair Ravenshaw was a name London spoke with a mix of admiration and caution. Young, wealthy, dangerous in the way men with confidence and privilege often were. He moved through Mayfair like he owned the streets. He was known for two things: power and horses, fast enough to turn a derby into legend. Then he bought a stallion from Ireland, Storm Sovereign, a black giant of a creature with speed in its bones and violence in its blood. At least that was what the rumors claimed. He broke a trainer's arm, threw two riders, refused tack, refused reins, refused all the usual methods that men like Ravenshaw believed would bend anything to their will. A servant at Ravenshaw Hall had once whispered, "That horse isn't a racer. He's a storm." Ravenshaw had laughed at that. He did not believe there was such a thing as an untrainable horse. He believed there were only weak trainers, timid hands, and a lack of discipline. So he took Storm Sovereign to every respected stable he could find, and watched men fail, watched pride crack, watched fear bloom. Finally, an older trainer in Newmarket said carefully, "Your Grace, perhaps you should try Whitcombe Estate." Ravenshaw frowned. "Why?" The man hesitated. "They say Earl Whitcombe's daughter has a way with horses." Ravenshaw's mouth curved faintly. "Whitcombe's daughter." He shrugged, amused. "If she can make that horse stand still, I'll eat my hat." And so Storm Sovereign arrived at Whitcombe Estate, and Ravenshaw laid eyes on Beatrice Whitcombe. And because he was Ravenshaw, because cruelty came easier than humility, because his world rewarded sharpness, he mocked her, only to watch minutes later as his savage stallion bowed its head to her shoulder like a penitent. Once the arrangement was made, Whitcombe estate shifted again. Mornings began earlier. The stables woke before the manor. Beatrice arrived at dawn when the air was cold and clean and the fields were still. Storm Sovereign lifted his head at the sound of her steps, not with anger, with attention. One morning Ravenshaw stood at the stall doorway while Beatrice entered without rope or whip, carrying only a small pouch. "What's that?" he asked. "Carrots," Beatrice replied. Ravenshaw's brow lifted. "Bribery." Beatrice smiled faintly. "Courtesy." Storm Sovereign stepped forward. Beatrice offered her palm, let him sniff, then fed him slowly, one piece at a time. Ravenshaw turned to Dalton, voice low. "I've never seen him like this." Dalton swallowed. "It's as if he knows her." Beatrice began with what looked to Ravenshaw like nothing at all. Simple walking, circles, stopping when asked, starting when asked, learning that the space between command and response did not have to be filled with fear. Ravenshaw watched, increasingly impatient. "You aren't training him to run. I'm training him to trust," Beatrice said. "A racehorse trusts the rider because the rider is in control." Beatrice's gaze remained on the stallion. If control is built on fear, it will break the moment fear becomes stronger. Ravenshaw's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Another day he found Beatrice in the paddock. Storm Sovereign trotted in a wide circle around her, completely loose, no halter, no rope. Ravenshaw stared. "You've let him free." "I've given him a choice," Beatrice answered. "Horses don't need choices." Beatrice looked at him then. "Every living thing does." The days passed and small miracles piled up like stones in a wall. Storm Sovereign let Dalton brush his coat only if Beatrice was nearby. He accepted a saddle without bucking, only after Beatrice stood at his shoulder and whispered calm words. He allowed Hawthorne, the chosen jockey, to mount briefly only after Beatrice steadied the stallion's breath with her hand against his neck. Ravenshaw watched it all with a growing uncomfortable awareness. Beatrice was not weak. She was not lucky. She was not simply kind. She was skilled, and her skill wasn't loud. It didn't perform. It simply worked. One afternoon, Storm Sovereign burst into a sprint across the grass mane, flying hooves thundering like distant thunder. Ravenshaw's attention sharpened. The horse was faster than any rumor had promised. Beatrice lifted her voice, calm as ever. "Storm." The stallion turned instantly and came back to her at a trot, lowering his head as if awaiting her next word. Ravenshaw exhaled, barely audible. "Remarkable." Dalton, standing beside him, murmured, "Not remarkable, Your Grace." Ravenshaw glanced at him. Dalton's eyes stayed on Beatrice. "That's trust." One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and turned the stable windows into squares of amber, Beatrice lingered longer than usual. She brushed Storm Sovereign's coat with slow, steady strokes, her posture relaxed in a way Ravenshaw had never seen in London's glittering rooms. He entered quietly, not to interrupt, just to be there. "Do you never tire?" he asked. Beatrice's mouth lifted slightly. "I'm used to it." Ravenshaw leaned against a wooden post, arms folded. He seemed out of place in the gentle hush of the stable, as if he belonged to louder arenas, ballrooms, clubs, courts of influence. "London talks about you," he said. Beatrice shrugged. "London talks about everyone." He hesitated. There was a rare uncertainty in it, a pause that didn't fit the Duke's usual decisiveness. "What I said on the first day," he began. He stopped. Beatrice kept brushing eyes on the stallion. "I've heard worse my whole life." "That doesn't make it right," Ravenshaw said quietly. Beatrice's hand slowed. She didn't look at him. You weren't the first. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Ravenshaw's expression tightened. That makes it worse. Silence stretched. Then he asked almost bluntly, "Why are you still helping me?" Beatrice set down the brush and rested her hand on Storm Sovereign's neck. The horse stood perfectly still, as if listening. "Because he deserves a chance," she said. "Not everyone gets one." Ravenshaw's gaze flicked to the stallion, then back to Beatrice. For the first time since he arrived, he looked less like a man appraising a tool and more like a man confronted by something he did not know how to categorize. The rumor reached London before the third week ended. It began in Mayfair, in one of those clubs where men pretended they were discussing politics when they were really discussing control. "I heard Ravenshaw's lost his mind," a gentleman said, swirling brandy in a glass. "Why," another asked, "he's letting Lady Whitcombe train his stallion." A short, surprised laugh. "Lady Whitcombe, the one they call the fattest woman in London?" the first man said. "Delighted." A third voice chimed in. "They say the horse only listens to her." Silence followed. Then a snort. "A mad horse," someone said, and a woman's society turned into a joke. He lifted his drink, amusement glinting. "That will be the finest entertainment at Derby." And far away in Berkshire, in a quiet stable where no chandeliers glittered and no gossip carried, Beatrice Whitcombe ran her hand along the neck of a storm-black stallion and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not hope. Not yet. But the first faint outline of being seen by something that didn't care what London called her. The fog that morning lay low over Whitcombe Estate, turning the backfields into a pale sea and the hedgerows into dark islands. It was the kind of mist that muffled sound and made everything feel farther away than it was, house from stable, from paddock, past from present. Beatrice liked it. London never had fog like this. London had smoke and shatter and 1,000 sharp eyes that never blinked. Here the air was damp and honest, and even the birds seemed quieter. She reached the south stables before the other hands arrived, as she often did. The corridor inside smelled of hay, oiled leather, and warm animal breath. A lantern burned near the tack room, its flame steady, throwing long, calm shadows across the boards. Storm Sovereign lifted his head the moment he heard her steps. He did not stamp, did not fling his head, did not bare his teeth at the world. He simply watched her, alert, attentive, a storm held behind disciplined walls. "Good morning," Beatrice said. His ears flicked forward. He gave a low breath through his nostrils and moved toward the stall door, as if he had been waiting for her. Beatrice unlaced the stall and opened it, careful not to swing the door too fast. Storm Sovereign stepped out without rushing, shoulder brushing near her as he passed. She laid her palm on his neck, a quiet greeting, not a claim. "Easy," she murmured. They walked together into the yard. The grass beyond the stable glistened with dew, and the paddock fence was damp enough to darken the wood. Beatrice guided him toward the training ring, keeping her steps slow, giving him room to choose his pace. Halfway there, Storm Sovereign shifted his weight strangely. It was subtle, so subtle most people would have missed it. But Beatrice had learned to read horses the way some women read sheet music. A fraction of stiffness, a breath held too long, a foot placed a heartbeat slower than it should have been. She stopped. Storm Sovereign stopped with her nostrils flaring once, then settling. Beatrice crouched beside his hind leg, and there, under the sheen of his black coat, she saw them clearly for the first time. Scars, old ones, not the ragged kind caused by wire or a fall. These were long, narrow too, even to be accidents' parallel lines that ran across the muscle like faded handwriting, as if someone had once tried to carve obedience into him. Beatrice's throat tightened. Her hand hovered, then moved gently over the marks. Storm Sovereign didn't flinch, but his breathing changed just slightly, the way a man's breathing changes when you touch a bruise he pretends isn't there. Beatrice swallowed. "Oh!" Behind her footsteps approached. Mr. Dalton appeared, from the stable corridor coat thrown hastily over his shoulders, hair still damp from washing. "What is it, my lady?" he asked, voice cautious. Beatrice stood and pointed. "Do you see these?" Dalton bent closer. His face sobered. He ran a finger near one scar, not touching skin, just tracing the air. "They're not fresh," he said slowly. "No," Beatrice replied. "They're old." Dalton exhaled, and the breath sounded like resignation. "Someone beat him." Beatrice's jaw tightened. Not someone. Many someones. Dalton stared at the horse's leg eyes, narrowing, as if looking back through time. An Irish dealer, perhaps, or a trainer who thought cruelty was discipline. Beatrice's hand moved back to Storm Sovereign's neck. The stallion lowered his head, a fraction pressing into her touch. "It wasn't that he was vicious," she said quietly. "He was afraid." Dalton looked at the horse again, then at Beatrice. "If that's true, then every man who called him mad was wrong." Beatrice shook her head, once calm but absolute. "Not wrong." Dalton frowned. "Not wrong. They didn't want to understand him," Beatrice said. "They wanted to conquer him. They mistook fear for defiance." Storm Sovereign breathed out, slow, heavy, controlled. The fog around them curled like smoke around a fire that refused to die. Beatrice rested her forehead briefly against the horse's shoulder. "I understand you," she whispered so softly Dalton couldn't hear. "That's all." Later that morning, a carriage arrived from London with Ravenshaw's post. The wheels crunched over gravel, and the sound carried sharply in the quiet air. A footman brought a stack of sealed letters inside the manor, and another smaller bundle toward the stables. Beatrice had finished her morning session with Storm Sovereign and was heading toward the house when she heard voices through the open door of the drawing room. Ravenshaw's voice, low and controlled like a blade kept in a sheath. Dalton's voice, respectful but curious. Beatrice slowed, not meaning to eavesdrop, but the words caught her like a hook. "Your Grace," Dalton was saying, "I've wondered something since you arrived." Ravenshaw replied, "Yes, why Whitcombe Estate?" Dalton asked, "You've horses of your own trainers in Newmarket stables in Surrey. Why bring Storm Sovereign here?" There was a pause, short but telling. Then Ravenshaw answered plainly without shame, "Because I heard of Lady Whitcombe." Beatrice's fingers tightened on the banister beside her. Dalton sounded surprised. "You knew of her?" Ravenshaw gave a faint, humorless exhale. "A trainer in Newmarket told me the Earl's daughter had a particular ability, that she could calm horses no one else could touch." He added as if it were a simple calculation. If anyone could handle Storm Sovereign, it was likely her. Beatrice stood still in the hall, heartbeat steady but hard. The truth settled in her chest like cold metal. Ravenshaw continued, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, of the effect his words might have. "I didn't come to Berkshire for your paddocks," he said. "I came because of her." Dalton's voice lowered, more careful now. "Then why did you mock her on the first day?" Silence. A full second, maybe two, in which Beatrice could almost see Ravenshaw's pride measuring itself against honesty. Then he answered, "Because I didn't believe it." Beatrice's breath left her in a thin, quiet stream. Of course. Of course he had known. Of course he had come for her. Of course he had tested her the way men like him tested everything, by provoking it, by pressing until it either broke or proved itself. And when she didn't break, when she proved herself, he had simply taken it. Beatrice turned away before either man could notice her in the hallway. She moved with controlled steps, not hurried, because she would not be seen fleeing, not even in her own house. But inside her chest something shifted. Not fear, not shame, anger. It was strange how anger could feel cleaner than sadness. Sadness had lived with her for so long it had become background noise. Anger was new. Anger had edges. Anger made a person stand straighter. By afternoon the fog had lifted. The sun warmed the paddock fence, and the estate looked almost idyllic, as if it were painted for a storybook. Beatrice walked to the training ring, where Storm Sovereign was being exercised at a loose canter. His stride was powerful, controlled, and for a moment the scars on his legs flashed again beneath the movement ghost marks, reminders of what men had tried to do to him. Ravenshaw stood by the fence watching the stallion with a critical eye. He looked like a man measuring distance, weighing time, calculating outcome. Not simply admiring the horse, planning with him. Beatrice stepped beside him. She didn't soften her voice. She didn't prepare him. She didn't try to make the truth gentle. "You knew about me before you came here." Ravenshaw turned his head slowly. His gaze landed on her face, sharp, assessing. He didn't pretend confusion. "You heard," he said. "Yes," Beatrice replied. "I heard you tell Dalton." Ravenshaw didn't deny it. "Then you know," Beatrice's mouth tightened. "You came to Whitcombe Estate because of me." Ravenshaw nodded once. "Yes." Beatrice let out a small bitter laugh that held no humor. "And you still chose to mock me." Ravenshaw's jaw flexed. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence tasted like arrogance. Beatrice continued, voice steady. "I was a tool." Ravenshaw's eyes narrowed. "A tool A means to an end," she said. "A way to win the derby." Ravenshaw took a step closer. His presence was imposing. Men like him learned early that most people retreated when they advanced. Beatrice didn't retreat. He spoke carefully. At first, yes. The words struck like a slap, not because she hadn't expected them, but because he said them without flinching. Beatrice's eyes cooled. At first, Ravenshaw exhaled. "Beatrice," she cut him off. "Don't." Ravenshaw's expression sharpened. "Don't what speak?" "Don't say my name as if it gives you rights," she replied. Something flickered in Ravenshaw's eyes, surprise, then irritation, then something quieter. He didn't seem used to feeling in the face of resistance. He said, "It was not." "It was exactly what it was," Beatrice replied. Storm Sovereign swept past the fence mane, flaring, and for a brief moment, the stallion seemed to glance at them as if listening. Beatrice's voice dropped. "You sought me out. You brought that horse here because you believed I could do what others failed to do. And instead of showing respect, you chose humiliation. You chose the same cruelty London has always used." Ravenshaw's gaze held hers. "I was wrong." Beatrice gave a faint, unimpressed smile. "That is not an apology. That is a statement." Ravenshaw's jaw tightened again. He looked as if he wanted to argue to justify to win, but something in her face stopped him. Not softness, not pleading, a kind of calm certainty that refused to be moved. He said quietly, "I needed the horse." Beatrice nodded. "Yes, and I believed he admitted that anyone claiming to have a way with him would be another trainer of selling hope." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "So you tested me?" Ravenshaw didn't deny it. "Yes," Beatrice turned slightly, watching Storm's sovereign circle. And when I didn't fail, you decided to what claim the miracle as yours, use it. Ravenshaw's voice came lower. I did not claim you. Beatrice's laughter this time was soft, but it carried a blade. You claimed my work. You claimed my time. And you would have claimed my dignity if I had let you. Ravenshaw went still. For the first time, the Duke looked less like a man in control, and more like a man realizing he had misjudged the weight of the thing he held. He took a breath. At first he said, choosing the words as if he knew one wrong syllable would shatter what little ground he had. I needed you because of the horse. Beatrice's eyes hardened. Ravenshaw continued. But now, I need you because of you. Beatrice's throat tightened, but she didn't show it. She refused to offer him the satisfaction of seeing the words land. She said very quietly, then focus on the derby. And she walked away, leaving him at the fence with the wind, turning the grass into waves around his boots. That night Ravenshaw rode to London. He claimed it was for financial matters. Beatrice suspected it was also because he needed air, needed distance from a woman who had not bent when he expected her to. London greeted him like a familiar beast, bright rooms, loud laughter, silk and smoke. The sharp, satisfied hum of men who believed their words could shape the world. At White's Club, the air was heavy with brandy and money. Cards slapped tables, coins clinked. Gossip traveled faster than servants. Lord Percival Montague sat at a gaming table, a glass of whiskey in hand, eyes half-lidded, as he watched a man lose too much too quickly. Montague was handsome in a polished way, hair perfectly styled, coat immaculate. His smile was a weapon worn like jewelry. A gentleman leaned toward him, voice eager. Have you heard about Ravenshaw Montague's mouth curved? Of course. They say he's been hiding in Berkshire with his mad stallion, the man continued, at Whitcombe Estate. Montague took a slow sip. Yes. And they say the gentleman added, delighted, that the horse only listens to Lady Whitcombe. Montague laughed an easy, careless sound. Lady Whitcombe. The other man grinned. You know, the fattest woman in London. Montague shook his head as if savoring the absurdity. How charming. A mad horse and a woman's society turned into a joke. Ravenshaw's presence turned the room before anyone announced him. Men looked up, conversations, shifting, small currents of attention flowing toward him. Montague's eyes flicked in his direction and brightened. Ah, Montague said, raising his glass. Ravenshaw. Ravenshaw's expression didn't change. Montague. Rumor says, Montague continued, tone light, that you're placing a great deal of hope on Storm's sovereign. Ravenshaw's voice was cold. He'll win the derby. Montague's smile sharpened. Will he? A few men leaned in, sensing entertainment. Montague set his glass down with deliberate care. I've wagered he won't. Ravenshaw's eyes narrowed. Of course you have. A gentleman at the table asked, how much Montague? Montague answered, with the calm of a man who enjoyed excess because he could afford it. 20,000 pounds. The table went quiet. Someone whistled softly. Ravenshaw's jaw set. That's a foolish bet. Montague leaned forward slightly. I hope you haven't built your future on a mad horse. Ravenshaw's gaze held Montague's. I haven't. Montague's smile was almost sympathetic. Then perhaps you've built it on Lady Whitcombe. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the men. Ravenshaw's face didn't change, but something dangerous tightened behind his eyes. Speak carefully, he said. Montague spread his hands. I'm only enjoying the spectacle. Derby will be delightful this year. Ravenshaw left the club without another word, but Montague's laughter followed him down the corridor like a shadow. Back in Berkshire, the estate slept under a clear sky. The fields were quiet. The manor's windows glowed softly. The stables, however, were never entirely asleep. Not with a stallion like Storm's sovereign within them. Not with the derby drawing nearer like a drumbeat. The night before they were meant to leave for Epsom, Beatrice returned to the stables long after the other hands had gone to bed. She told herself she was only checking Storm's sovereign one last time. She told herself she wasn't restless. She told herself she wasn't thinking about Ravenshaw's words at the fence. Storm's sovereign lifted his head when she entered, but something was wrong immediately. His breathing was off. His eyes looked too bright. He shifted his weight as if the floor were uncertain beneath him. Beatrice's stomach dropped. "Storm," she whispered, stepping closer. The stallion's legs trembled slightly. Beatrice moved quickly, checking his mouth, his gums the warmth in his ears. Then her gaze snapped to the water bucket. She knelt. A scent rose from the water, sharp, unfamiliar. Not hay, not grain, not clean. Beatrice's voice cut through the stable like a whip. Dalton footsteps thundered. Dalton burst through the door, half-dressed, panic already on his face. "What is it?" Beatrice pointed at the bucket. Someone put something in his water. Dalton leaned in, sniffed, then swore under his breath. Damn them. Storm Sovereign shook his head once as if trying to rid himself of dizziness. "Fresh water," Beatrice ordered. Dalton didn't question her. He ran. Beatrice moved to Storm Sovereign's side, hand pressing against his neck, feeling the tremor beneath his skin. "Stay with me," she murmured. "Stay with me." Minutes later, Ravenshaw arrived. He looked as if he had been pulled from sleep shirt, unbuttoned at the collar hair, slightly tousled eyes, sharp with sudden alarm. "What happened?" he demanded, scanning the stallion. The bucket Beatrice's pale face. Beatrice didn't look at him. Someone tried to poison him. Ravenshaw's hands clenched at his sides. Montague. Beatrice didn't respond. She had already moved to the small cabinet where herbs and simple remedies were kept. She pulled down jars, the movements quick but precise. Ravenshaw watched her hands. "Will he live if we act quickly?" she said, voice clipped. Dalton returned with fresh water, breathless. Beatrice poured it out, rinsed the bucket, replaced it. Storm Sovereign tried to drink, then recoiled, nauseated. Beatrice took a cloth, dampened it, wiped foam from his mouth, then mixed a crude antidote from charcoal powder and a bitter herb. Ravenshaw's voice lowered. "Tell me what to do." Beatrice glanced at him, once surprised by the humility, then pointed. "Hold his head steady, not tight, just steady." Ravenshaw stepped in. Storm Sovereign's eyes flashed, but Beatrice's hand remained firm on his neck. "It's all right," she whispered. "He won't hurt you." Ravenshaw placed a hand near the stallion's jaw, feeling the heat, the tremble. For the first time he looked less like a duke, and more like a man facing something he couldn't buy his way out of. They worked through the night. Storm Sovereign sweated, trembled, then slowly, agonizingly, slowly began to stabilize. His breathing eased, his legs stopped shaking. Beatrice sat on the straw beside him, back against the stall wall, refusing to leave. Ravenshaw stayed too. At some point, Dalton fell asleep in a chair near the door, exhaustion dragging him down. The stable grew quiet except for the stallion's breath. Outside, the first hint of dawn lightened the horizon. Ravenshaw looked at Beatrice in the dim. His voice was rough, stripped of performance. "I was wrong about you." Beatrice's eyes remained on Storm Sovereign. "What matters is, You're not wrong about him. Ravenshaw swallowed. He's not mad. No, she said softly. He's wounded. Storm Sovereign exhaled a low sound that seemed almost like agreement. The stable door creaked slightly with the changing air, and dawn spilled into the aisle like a pale ribbon. Epsom Downs the next morning was a living creature. Noise rolled across the hills, in waves laughter shouting the bark of bookmakers, the bright chatter of aristocrats who treated horses like entertainment and men like wagers. Carriages lined the road in long, gleaming rows. Ladies in summer dresses stepped carefully onto the grass parasols lifted against the sun. Gentlemen adjusted their top hats and scanned the crowd as if searching for both profit and scandal. 3-1 on Storm Sovereign, a bookmaker shouted. A man scoffed. Ravenshaw's mad horse. I wouldn't stake a penny. In the stables behind the track, the air smelled of sweat leather and anticipation. Storm Sovereign stood in a private stall reserved for favored contenders. His coat shone muscles tense as drawn bowstrings, but his eyes, though bright, were steady. Beatrice stood at his shoulder, her hand rested on his neck, fingers moving in slow strokes. Storm Sovereign lowered his head near her shoulder, breathing calm as if the crowd outside did not exist. Sir Julian Hawthorne arrived, the jockey chosen for Ravenshaw's horse. He was lean, confident eyes, sharp with the focus of men who lived by speed and risk. I've ridden many horses at Derby Hawthorne, said, studying Storm Sovereign. I've never seen one like this, Beatrice replied quietly. He doesn't like to be forced. Hawthorne nodded, as if he understood that truth at a deeper level than most aristocrats. I'll remember. Ravenshaw entered the stall dressed in black, with the Ravenshaw crest on his chest. The sight of it reminded Beatrice that this day was not only about the horse, it was about pride, money, revenge, everything men like Ravenshaw carried in their blood. His eyes went to Beatrice and Storm Sovereign. For a brief moment his expression softened, not warmth exactly, but something close. Is he all right? Ravenshaw asked. Better than yesterday, Beatrice answered. Ravenshaw reached out and brushed his fingers along the stallion's mane. Storm Sovereign did not lash out. A servant hurried in. Your Grace, 5 minutes. Ravenshaw turned to Beatrice, his voice lowered. Whatever happens today, he began. He stopped as if the rest of the sentence felt too exposed. I owe you more than I can repay. Beatrice shook her head. You owe him, she said, touching Storm Sovereign's neck. You owe him a life where he isn't punished for surviving. Storm Sovereign gave a soft snort. Hawthorne smiled faintly. I think he agrees. When the handlers led Storm Sovereign toward the track, the sound from the stands surged like a tide. People craned their necks, binoculars lifted. Voices rose eager for a story. A nobleman peered through his glass. That's Storm Sovereign. Someone beside him said, and that's Lady Whitcombe. A woman whispered behind a fan, the fattest woman in London. Beatrice felt the words hit her like old rain, familiar cold, irritating. She did not flinch. She kept walking beside the stallion, fingers brushing his neck breath steady. Storm Sovereign stepped onto the track. The other horses lined up, restless stamping. Hawthorne mounted smoothly, posture low and ready. Storm Sovereign pawed the ground once. Beatrice stood near the rail, close enough for him to see her. She said softly, easy. Storm Sovereign lifted his head, ears forward. The bell rang. The gates snapped open. The horses exploded forward like arrows. Storm Sovereign began in the middle of the pack, not leading, not lagging, simply moving, measured, powerful, as if he were gathering himself. A man on the stand scoffed. "He won't keep up." Montague stood nearby, smiling faintly. "I told you." Beatrice's hands clenched on the rail, knuckles whitening, but her face remained still. At the second bend, Storm's Sovereign surged, not a frantic burst, a controlled release of speed like a storm deciding to arrive. Hawthorne leaned with the motion, his body becoming part of the horse's rhythm. The stallion lengthened his stride, ate the ground. A shout rose from the stands. Look, Storm Sovereign passed the third horse, then the second. The turf trembled beneath his hooves. The sound was deep, relentless thunder contained in flesh. Montague's smile faltered. Beatrice's throat tightened. She didn't breathe properly until the stallion hit the final straight. There, Storm Sovereign unleashed everything. He ran like the wind itself had chosen him. No horse matched his pace. No rider found an answer. Hawthorne's shouted voice lost in the roar. Go Storm Sovereign crossed the finish line first. For a heartbeat, there was disbelief. Then the stands erupted. Storm Sovereign wins. God Ravenshaw did it. Beatrice's breath broke out of her like laughter and tears mixed together, but she forced herself to stay standing, forced herself not to collapse into relief. Hawthorne dismounted when the stallion was led toward the winner's area. Storm Sovereign's sides heaved, but he stood strong eyes, bright body, steady, alive. Beatrice stepped forward. Storm Sovereign lowered his head toward her instantly, as if the victory meant nothing compared to this. A photographer nearby cried, "Look at that." People pushed forward hungry for the image, the wild stallion bowing to the woman London mocked. Ravenshaw descended from the stands, moving through the crowd as if it parted for him instinctively. He walked straight to Beatrice. For the first time, Beatrice noticed the way his hands trembled slightly, the way emotion strained against his control. He stopped in front of her. "You did what no one else could." Beatrice shook her head, voice quiet. "No." "He did." Ravenshaw's eyes held hers. "No." He turned briefly toward the crowd, then back to her, as if making a decision that would echo long after this day. Then, without warning, he lifted Beatrice off the ground. The crowd burst into laughter and applause, not mocking laughter, but surprised delight. The kind of noise that carried admiration instead of cruelty. A woman gasped, "That's Lady Whitcombe." A man beside her frowned, "The fattest woman in London." The woman shook her head, eyes wide, "No." She watched Beatrice in the Duke's arms, watched the stallion bow to her like a loyal creature. "That's the woman who just won Derby." Ravenshaw set Beatrice down gently, as if afraid of hurting her, as if she were precious rather than inconvenient. A young aristocrat near the rail smirked, trying to salvage old cruelty from the wreckage of surprise. "I didn't expect Derby to be won by—" He waved a hand vaguely, eyes darting toward Beatrice's body, "a horse and a joke." A few nervous chuckles rose. Beatrice turned her head slowly. Before she could speak, Ravenshaw stepped forward. He stood directly in front of the young man, his height and authority making the air feel colder. His voice came out quiet and razor-sharp. "What did you say?" The young aristocrat shrugged a tempting bravado. "I only meant—" Ravenshaw cut him off. "This woman has more strength than all of you," he said, each word crisp with controlled fury. "And more courage." Silence fell like a curtain. No one laughed after that. Not because Ravenshaw was a duke, because the truth of his words had finally become undeniable. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, the chaos of the Derby began to soften into aftermath. People wandered to tents, to champagne, to gossip. Some spoke of bets won and lost. Some spoke of Ravenshaw's victory. Some spoke quietly, almost reverently, of the way the stallion bowed to Lady Whitcombe. Storm Sovereign was settled into the winner's stall, watered, cooled down, watched carefully by handlers who treated him now like a sacred thing. Beatrice stood at his shoulder, stroking his mane. The stallion breathed steadily, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, but when Beatrice's fingers moved along his neck, he leaned into her touch. Ravenshaw approached from behind footsteps, unhurried. His presence felt different than it had in the stable weeks ago. Less like a man claiming, more like a man asking permission simply by stopping at a respectful distance. "Beatrice," he said. She turned. Ravenshaw took a breath as if he were preparing to speak a truth he had avoided his whole life. "I thought I needed this horse to win Derby," he said. Beatrice's eyes held his. She didn't interrupt. Ravenshaw continued, voice steady, but raw. "I thought winning would fix everything. Debt, reputation, the damage men, like Montague, have spent years trying to do." He looked towards Storm Sovereign, then back to her. "But it wasn't the horse that changed everything," he said quietly. "It was you." Beatrice's lips parted slightly. She said, "Careful, because I trained him." Ravenshaw shook his head. "No." His gaze sharpened with sincerity. "Because you refused to be what London called you. Because you stood in front of a storm and didn't flinch." Beatrice swallowed. "You flinched." Ravenshaw's mouth tightened, accepting the truth. "Yes." He stepped closer. "On the first day," he said, "I saw you through the eyes of every cruel room I've ever stood in." Beatrice's chest tightened, but she didn't look away. Ravenshaw continued, "I thought mockery made me untouchable." He gave a bitter, almost embarrassed exhale. "It made me small." Beatrice's voice came soft but firm. "Words don't vanish because you regret them." "I know," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A ring. Simple. Gold. Not overly ornate. It looked like something chosen with intention rather than spectacle. Beatrice stared. Ravenshaw's voice lowered. "I don't want you because you made my horse win." He paused. "I want you because you are you." Beatrice's fingers curled slightly, as if her body didn't know whether to accept or protect itself. Ravenshaw held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" Beatrice looked at Storm Sovereign. The stallion lifted his head slightly and snorted, as if impatient with human drama. She almost smiled. Then she looked back at the Duke. "Not because you are a duke," she said, quietly. Ravenshaw's throat moved as he swallowed. "I wouldn't ask you to." "And not because you won Derby," she added. "I know," he said, voice rough. Beatrice's eyes searched his face, searching for arrogance, for calculation, for the old coldness. What she saw instead was vulnerability, still proud, still dangerous, but stripped of certainty. She said softly, "You came to Whitcombe Estate because you needed me." "Yes," Ravenshaw admitted. "I did." Beatrice's voice remained steady. "And you mocked me." Ravenshaw's jaw tightened. "Yes." Beatrice took a slow breath. "Then understand this." She stepped closer, not away. "If I say yes," she said, "it will not be because you saved me from London." Ravenshaw's eyes flickered. I wouldn't insult you by believing you needed saving." Beatrice nodded once satisfied. "It will be because you learned to see me," she said, "and because you learned to stop treating living beings as prizes." Ravenshaw's gaze dropped briefly to Storm Sovereign, then returned to Beatrice. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I'm not worthy yet, but I'm trying." Beatrice's throat tightened. She held the feeling down like a rein, Storm Sovereign snorted again, a low, impatient sound. Beatrice's mouth finally curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't pain either. She reached for the ring and nodded. "Yes," she said. Ravenshaw exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for years. He didn't kiss her with ownership. He didn't pull her into a performance for the crowd. He simply lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, gentle, reverent, like a promise he intended to earn every day. Behind them, Storm Sovereign lowered his head again, a quiet bow that felt like approval. And though the derby had been loud, and London would make it louder still, Beatrice knew the real victory had already happened in the stable weeks ago, when a wild stallion had chosen her, and she had finally chosen herself. In the years that followed, people would tell the story 1,000 ways. They would say the Duke won the derby with a mad stallion no one could handle. They would say Storm Sovereign was a legend born from blood and lightning. They would say Montague lost 20,000 pounds and nearly choked on his pride. But the version that mattered, the one whispered by stable hands, by women in drawing rooms, by men who pretended they didn't believe in miracles, was always the same at its heart. They called her the fattest woman in London, until the wild stallion refused everyone except her. And so the woman London once mocked became the only person a wild stallion truly trusted, proving that strength is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is patience, kindness, and quiet courage that change everything. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. If it moved you, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about unlikely heroes and unforgettable bonds, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one.